Welcome. My name is Lloyd Borrell. I'm your host. Today I'm thrilled to have as my guest Professor Trevor Marshall. Professor Marshall is a fellow of the European Association for Predictive, Preventive and Personalized Medicine. He's a member of the International Expert Council Community of Practice on Preventive Medicine in Moscow, and he's the author of numerous studies. The most recent study is entitled Electrosmog and Autoimmune Disease. And he is currently director of the non-profit organization, the Autoimmunity Research Foundation. Professor Trevor, welcome to the EMF Health Summit.
Oh, it's good to be here, Lloyd.
It's a real pleasure to have you on. So firstly, can I ask you the question quite simply, what got you onto the EMF trail? Because I know you started teaching electrical engineering, but so what got you onto this subject of EMFs?
Well, actually, I was very interested in EMFs, but not from a health aspect, purely from an engineering aspect from high school. I was a radio amateur at that time, 15, 16 years old. And I actually was playing a lot with microwaves, and I set an Australian record, amongst other things. So I did quite a lot, quite early.
Yeah.
But in terms of what got me onto the health aspects, 15 years ago, around the turn of the millennium, I stumbled across an action for a commonly prescribed drug, which made it very effective at reversing chronic diseases, such as the autoimmune diseases. And most of my publications over the last 20 years have been in that field and focusing on that area. And we have been tracking a cohort of several hundred patients for all of that time, 18 years or so. And I was noticing that from about 2010 onwards, we were getting people who just were no longer responding in the same way as they had done before that. Some people were really struggling to get gains against their disease. And I couldn't really figure out why. And many of them were telling me, well, it's the EMF. I'm very sensitive to EMFs. And I should have paid more attention to them, but I didn't. But about two to 3 years ago, I met a German academic at a conference in China. Mm-hmm. And Prof. Mile from Germany. And he had been working with physicians in Europe, particularly in France and Germany, to produce a device which he calls scalar waves, but is really just near field, quite standard technologies. And I'd heard that this had an effect on people, on the patients. And I thought, well, let's go and find out about it. And I went to a conference in Lyon to find out about it. And in particular, I talked to some of these physicians that were treating the patients, and they were very clever, honest academics.
Yeah.
Most of them were academics and physician academics. And I thought, well, maybe there's something in that. So when I got back to California, I replicated his work, built some of his big systems, the same as they're using at some of the spas in Germany, some of the recuperative spas. And I found, yes, we made, I think, half a dozen, maybe a dozen units, and we sent them out to volunteers. And we found, yes, people could sense that there was something going on when they switched the units on.
Okay. So can I just backtrack a little bit before you go further, just to clarify? So just to summarize maybe, so you've been doing this research on the immune system, on autoimmune diseases.
Yep.
You reached a stumbling block because you're using drug therapy for this, and it wasn't working anymore. So you were scratching your head looking for answers. You stumbled across this research by this German gentleman, academic, and you started to experiment with what he'd found by using frequencies, certain frequencies, with the idea being to have a beneficial effect. Is that correct?
No, not really. It's nothing like the frequencies that most of us think about these days when we talk about EMFs. Nothing like those frequencies at all. I was interested from an engineering perspective in this case, what was the human body sensitive to? Firstly, was the human body sensitive to anything, because it shouldn't have been.
Yes.
From standard theory. And if it was sensitive, what is it sensitive to? Is it sensitive only to cell phones, or what is it sensitive to?
Right, because you were taught that, because you're an engineer by training, you were taught that this what cell phones are using, what Wi-Fi using was safe. Agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I played with it my whole life. I built transmitters for aircraft beacons and all sorts of RF stuff that didn't do me any good at all, as it turns out. But because of the way that the human body is affected so profoundly by EMFs, it's very hard to tie together an exposure to an effect. I find that the exposure to effect is maybe 4 to 6 hours to get any effect at all, unless it's really strong. I mean, if it's really strong, you just get knocked out. I think everybody does if it's strong enough. But after 4 to 6 hours, seemed to be kicking in. And then my colleagues were reporting, but it lasts for days. And that was the key, that really the worst effects are the next day. And then the effects can hang around for days because it affects the immune system.
So so just to be clear, you're talking about what I call EMFs, electromagnetic fields. Yeah, these cell phone, Wi-Fi, etc. frequencies, or other frequencies, power frequencies. Yeah. You're talking about these frequencies generally, yes?
Yes,
yeah.
Talking in general. And I specifically was interested in finding out what they did, if anything. Because most people haven't thought too much about how sensitive the human body is. There was one study I came across from 1977 by William Bice, which indicated with his research group that very, very low intensities indeed, very hard to measure intensities, in fact, were sufficient to upset EEG, electroencephalograms, of his lab patients. Well, actually, his lab colleagues were the rats in this case, because back in those days it was fairly typical. You all, as the researcher that makes the breakthrough, you're usually the one that ends up like the Madame Curie of the, the discovery. So I'd seen his work. I didn't know much about it, but it was sort of interesting to me, how sensitive is the human body, because I keep reading about if you put cell phones up to your ear, it'll cause cancer and things. Yeah, okay, but what about the rest of us? What about the patients that are complaining about just the radiation in the environment between the cell towers and the people? Mm-hmm. At my presentation, or between the cell towers and the cell phones, at my presentation last week in Lisbon, which will be online, I think it's online by the time we go to air. And at that one, I play a little video from NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Just a little 1-minute video, which basically talks a bit about electromagnetics and then points out that in everywhere we are, there are waves coming from all around us that we have no concept of how to measure in many cases or how to detect in some cases, and that they fill the space, and that filling of the space, the interaction between them, the interaction between the biology and the waves is really what is the basis of the term electrosmog.
Okay. Because there is, you're talking about electrode smog, but then there's all kinds of, so that's a NASA video talking about electrode smog as I understand it, but then there's all kinds of frequencies coming at us, isn't there? Because there's frequencies from the Earth, there's frequencies from the cosmos, so we've got the natural and the non-natural, or the native and the non-native. So what you're talking about is the non-native. That's what you're talking about. Yeah.
Non-native, non-natural is what I'm interested in. Yeah. Man-made radiation.
Yeah.
And it does. It spans all the way from the bottom end, the magnetic spectrum with power lines, 60 hertz and house wiring. It goes up through the radio bands, the AM radio band, and then goes up to FM, through shortwave to FM, then to radios, and then up to the bottom of the microwave bands where the cell phones are starting to work.
Right.
And it continues to go up. Currently frequencies up to about 100 gigahertz are usable. And they're talking about using some of those for 5G. And I've been playing with 60 gigahertz and 106 gigahertz systems to try and get a feel for exactly how those higher millimeter wave frequencies affect human biology as well. But look, what was being demonstrated by Konstantin Mayl was that very low frequencies in the shortwave radio range were capable of affecting the human body. He was saying in a beneficial way, but honestly, I really don't care whether it's a beneficial way or a non-beneficial way, because my outlook is any interference at all is bad. The body can handle the stimulus for which the stimuli for which we have evolved, and if we feel that we can do a better job than the body at regulating the body's operation, then we're deluded. So I'm really interested in identifying that. So I made some of his systems. I've got one here. Got part of one here. And he was using these bright stainless steel balls on the top. And then there was a circuit board down here with, here we are, it's just...
Okay, yeah, I can see that, yes.
With a coil, which he calls a Tesla coil, but to me as an engineer, it's just an inductor.
Okay.
Inductor. But that produces a very high impedance, which then couples into the environment capacitively between these two balls, one ball on each side of the patient.
I see.
It was his.
Put the patient in the middle.
Put the patient in.
On, and then we look what happens. And from your perspective, you're saying that any effect is not a good effect because it's non-natural.
Yeah, well, I slightly different from that. I'd say any effect is what I want to identify.
Yes.
Bad effect or good effect or no effect.
Yes.
Really.
Yes.
Because I think we're still at that stage of gathering ideas on exactly what is going on out there.
So So the first observation with these frequencies, which I understand were about 27 megahertz, is that correct?
Well, that one is about 6 megahertz.
Okay, so it's a bit lower. So which is way lower than, so just for people that are listening, a megahertz is 1 million cycles a second. And for instance,
one of the ways to think about these frequencies is not to think about them as frequencies, but concentrate on the wavelength. That's the size of the wave as it travels through the air between the two adjacent 0 points. And when you're talking about AM radio, you're talking about wavelengths around 300 meters. So that each wave is in existence in 300 meters of space. And only a little bit of that affects us at any point in time. The wave is very much larger than us. That's at AM radio frequencies. At mile frequencies, 6 megahertz, the wavelength was closer to 50 meters, 50 meters. Still a very big wave, very long wave that can go around obstacles, easily go around shielding that's typically found in housing, what we normally call short wave. And then you go up to the FM radio band, and for FM radio, you're talking about 3 meters. And now you're getting down to a size commensurate with humans, because, in fact, a 3 meter wave will induce quite a large current in a human body. So, and there'd be a voltage differential between the two ends of the human body. And then as you go up to let's say a gigahertz, which is the most active of the cell phone bands, and you're talking about a wavelength of about 1/3 of a meter. So you're down to about a foot now in size, 30 centimeters in size. And then you're starting to get waves that will affect specific parts of the body differentially. And these waves, though, are quite small, so they're much easier to block. And then further up, you get to Wi-Fi. The shortest Wi-Fi waves are about 6 gigahertz. I'm doing some quick arithmetic in my head. 300 divided by 6,000 is 1/20th. So you're talking about a 20th of a meter in wavelength there, and it's getting really quite small. And as the frequencies get even higher into the millimeter bands, the wavelengths get to millimeter lengths.
Hence
and they can get, hence the name, and they can get through very small apertures indeed.
Which is where we're going with 5G, these very small wavelengths.
Yeah. We get because we can put more information over a given band in the millimeter waves, so therefore that's where the industry is driving things. But you can see we're covering already a huge span of wavelengths, and I mentioned 60 hertz. The wavelength is essentially huge. I mean, it's continental size at 60 hertz. And in fact, those low frequencies are used for communications with submarines. There are very large power transmitters in any country that operates submarines that are specifically used because they can penetrate the ocean and directly communicate at a very slow rate of data, but nevertheless communicate with submarines underwater. And they have 2 million watt transmitters located. There's 5 locations in the US and at least 1 in Britain and at least 1 in France. I think there's 2 in France, several in Germany, and of course many in Russia as well. Okay. So you've got electrosmog is all of these.
Yes.
All having an effect on your biology at any point in time. And we still don't know enough about whether they interact. They don't seem to interact. They seem to produce different effects, but we don't know that yet for sure.
When you say interact, you mean interact with each other, interact with the human body? Because there's quite a lot of research that these frequencies are interacting, or these wavelengths, as you call them, are interacting with the human body. Independent research. I mean, like the Bioinitiative report, for instance.
Yeah. But when somebody claims that a device like this is able to reduce symptoms, for example, of EHS, then they are saying that this has an effect on the human body which offsets the effects of cell phones, Wi-Fi, whatever. And sometimes that's feasible from an engineering standpoint. And sometimes that's feasible from a biological standpoint, but I'm looking for evidence of that as well as the individual elements affecting the human body. Do you understand what I'm saying?
So what do you mean by individual elements? You mean in terms of particular organs, organisms in our bodies?
No, there's particular wavelength coming from the 6 megahertz unit. Why do people think that makes them feel better and offset the effects of electrosmog in the room? And I'm trying to figure out that as well. That's a very deep question, of course. So I'm interested in basically all the data that I see.
What you're saying is, so you're saying, because I'm just listening to what you're saying there, and you're saying, why do people feel that? So it's almost as if there's an implication that there might be placebo effect. Is that what you're saying? That people are thinking?
No, not really. Medicine at this point in time is fixated on intervention. If something can be measured to indicate that you're ill, then your physician will do his level best to intervene and try and reverse what he thinks is going on. Which is very different from the philosophy that I expressed earlier in this interview, that I think it should be, get the hell out of here and let the body deal with it type thing.
Yes.
So most of the people that have been playing with that type of equipment have been claiming this or other advantage for it, or that it's some benefit in therapy. And to me, I don't think we're anywhere near being able to say that that's a real benefit at this point. I'm more interested in figuring out what affects us, how we can get patients away from it for a period of time sufficient to induce healing, so that when they come back into the real world, as it were, they're fully functional again.
So just to finish off on this point, are you saying that because there's a lot of gizmos on the market, so and which claim to have, and they've done some research, some of them anyway, and they claim they've got certain claims. Let's put it like that.
Claims.
So are you saying that buyer beware on these? Is that what you're saying?
Oh, absolutely. I haven't found anything at this point that actually genuinely manages to reverse a disease process, either the EHS or the disease that is being exacerbated by the EHS, the inflammation.
Right. So, okay. So the quick fix, we're both agreed for the moment.
Yeah, for the moment, yes.
Be very, very careful. And this is the advice I've always given people. And obviously, at the same time, you need to suck and see, try it for yourself. But because when you're in a real bad way, it's okay as, saying, be careful on that and this. But when you're desperate, I know what that is, because I went through this thing called electrical hypersensitivity or electromagnetic field intolerance syndrome, as we're now calling it more and more. And people do get desperate and they are looking for solutions. So be careful, because at the moment, as Professor Trevor is saying here, it's not black and white as to what the effects of these frequencies and these wavelengths are on our body, on our health.
That's right. And what is black and white is they do affect the immune system. There's enough good studies out there now to show that, including our own work. And once the immune system starts getting affected, then it becomes really, really difficult to figure out what's going on. We found this.
Right. And when you say affect the immune system, you mean that can be either way?
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, absolutely. Let me develop that. What happens is when your body recognizes that there is a pathogen, for example, a virus that it doesn't like, present, then it generates inflammation. It generates cytokine storm and can make you feel really very, very bad while it's getting rid of that inflammation. And when you're talking about chronic inflammation that may have taken years to develop, slowly, bit by bit, and that the body suddenly sees it and tries to reverse it, the symptoms can get very bad very quickly. So when somebody who is sensitive to electromagnetics because of some underlying chronic disease inflammatory process goes into a Faraday cage, after a few hours they'll be hurting badly, probably having psychotic effects and wanting to get out as quickly as they can. This is nothing new. We knew this back when I was at the university in the 60s and 70s. You had to be really very, very careful when using Faraday cages. And for the last year or so, that's what I've been focused on, which is, what, why, how, and what can we do about it? Because really the only way to shield yourself from all of these wavelengths is to use a Faraday cage environment. And that's what we've been doing for the last year now. Mm-hmm. But to go back to Mile, just excuse me. Konstantin Mile was using this device. I wanted to be able to send this out to volunteers in our cohort. Cohort was pretty desperately ill people, mostly fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic Lyme disease, and all of the autoimmune conditions, lupus, sarcoidosis, etc., to see whether it affected them. Mm-hmm. And we put together about maybe a dozen of these in total, large units, just to send them out to early adopters. And we found, hey, yes, there's something going on. So what I did was working with another engineer who had experience in broadcasting. We analysed how this thing worked, got in contact with an Italian engineer, actually, that had done a very thorough analysis of how the Mile equipment worked. And I managed to shrink it down to this, which is a little circuit board, just the size of a ruler, drawing ruler. And on that circuit board is a little LED, which when I switch it on...
Yeah, you can see that.
And the 3-digit display gives a measure of the strength of the received signal. And that is directly proportional to the capacitive waves which are traveling through the air. And the importance of that is a standard that different people can compare their sensitivities to in my cohort. And that's what we were interested in. I was interested in the minimum frequency, the minimum amplitude at which something happened. I think it says 122 at the moment, which is about the minimum. And amazingly, there wasn't a lot of difference between all of the dozen or so people that initially were reporting. That is a level that you cannot read on an EMF meter. It's about minus 90 dBm, and a sensitive gigahertz type EMF meter will go down to 60, 70 maybe. The new Cornet goes down to minus 70 dBm. But this is around minus 90 dBm. We know exactly the power that's going through the air because we have the voltage and we have the resistance across which that voltage is being measured. Standardized resistance up there. So it gives a...
So dBm, decibel, milliwatts, just to be clear, which is more of a... It's not really something that people that are listening perhaps familiar with because it's more of a physics unit, but it's...
Well, you know that the units that people are using are the units that have been shoved down their throat by the industry. The sidetracked from 1960s or so onwards has been this concept of heating, and therefore watts is important, and therefore everybody talks in terms of watts. I tend to think in terms of volts per meter.
Yes.
If I'm in an FM radio field, then there will be a voltage difference between my head and my feet, which is roughly a meter and a bit. And that volts per meter is what's going to be affecting the bulk of my body. So I'd like to talk in terms of volts per meter when it gets really strong.
Okay.
But
for instance, So for instance, the acoustimeter, it goes down to 0.02 volts per meter. So this level you're talking about is below that.
10,000 times less.
10,000 times less. Yes.
10,000 times less than the
acoustimeter, which is one of the best consumer meters out there, in my opinion.
One of the best consumer meters, yes. It's not all that sensitive. As I said, I mentioned the Cornet.
Agreed.
Yeah, the Cornet EDX 86, I think it is. Anyway,
85. Yes.
85, yeah. Is the new one is minus 70 dBm, which is close to the German machinery, and is a relatively inexpensive as far as these measuring equipment goes. So in order to measure these low frequency energies and validate that meter works on the front of the board, I have to use spectrum analyzers and far more sensitive instruments that are capable of operating near thermal noise, near the noise that the body itself generates, because all of our molecules are moving all the time in the human body. And I've got a little video, which I'll send you a copy so you can put it online for people to look at, that shows these molecules moving. And the molecules moving allows them to interact, allows them to move stochastically through the cells in which they function. But it also represents waves, because there are charged atoms in those molecules that are moving as well. And in my paper from 2016, Autoimmunity and Electrosmog, or Electrosmog and Autoimmune Disease, I point out two of those atoms, which are oxygen atoms, very highly charged, highly polar atoms, which are actually spinning in the animation that I did, the emulation that I did. And those atoms are emitting waves. All physics, whether you look at quantum physics or classical physics, says, yes, a charged particle movement will emit waves. Very weak waves, but waves. And similarly, waves that come in at near the frequencies at which those atoms are wiggling will affect the wiggling of those atoms, will affect the motion of the atoms. It affects the ability of the molecule to dock. And I found that the drug that I'd been working with, the olmesartan in the VDR, actually was a combination that had a resonance or a sensitivity, particular sensitivity, in the range about 6 gigahertz, which is the same as Wi-Fi, high-band Wi-Fi. And that's a big deal, because most scientists think in terms of it has to be a very high-frequency wave if it's associated with biology, because they've been working with tiny molecules that are easy to simulate, easy to calculate with. And those have high frequencies in the thousands of megahertz range, thousands of gigahertz range, well above where equipment is operating. But as the molecule gets bigger, then other resonances come into play. And I found one in particular that was in the microwave region that we're using at the moment commercially. And I have no doubt there are hundreds, maybe thousands more of molecular interactions within the human body that are affected within that range, depending on the exact nature of the electromagnetic radiation impinging on those molecules.
Okay, so just to put that very simply, a life is in this description which you've just given us is about wiggling of molecules, which if we could break it down even further, then it's wiggling of atoms. And all this, there are electrical waves which are created in this wiggling. And this, what you're saying is that there are certain frequencies, notably in the microwave range. And when we talk about microwave range, we're talking about what cell phones are using and Wi-Fi and so on, the smart meters perhaps, which are impacting because they're resonating with these molecules. So we have the beginning of an understanding of how these frequencies are impacting our health and, creating disease, perhaps.
Well, how they're interacting with biology, whether it's biology in the birds and the bees or us in general. The fundamental mechanism that physicists, certainly classical physicists, are not yet fully sold on. They think that a radiation has to have enough energy to displace an electron from an orbit in order to affect biology, but it doesn't. It only has to have enough energy to change the way that molecules interact. And biology is very sensitively set up in each species. In human species, somewhere around 34 degrees centigrade is what the human body works at. And if you heat the body up or you cool the body down, things don't work right. And the reason is that energy, that Boltzmann energy, the Boltzmann noise, which was first characterized by Boltzmann back in 1870 something, in the 19th century anyway. That Boltzmann noise is a characteristic of everything. It's a characteristic of the signals that come down to us through the atmosphere from satellites, the signals from long-distance transmission here on Earth. There is this flaw called noise, thermal noise, and it's temperature dependent. And the human body happens to have a thermal noise level around 34 degrees, give or take a bit. And the molecules don't move a lot in energy around that. A hydrogen bond, which is the most important bond that's made in biology, one of the most important bonds that's made in biology, a hydrogen bond has an energy only around 50 milli-electron volts, for example. Which is much smaller than an X-ray, but it's still enough to upset a molecular interaction.
Okay, so let me ask you, please. So your research has lots of implications. One of your findings is that the brain is 1,000 times more sensitive to microwaves than previously thought. We are just way more sensitive.
Way more sensitive. I mean, if you take the BioInitiative data, the BioInitiative level that Cindy and her colleagues set, Cindy Sage set, was around minus 47 dBm in dBm, after allowing a times 10 factor for precautionary factor, about minus 47 dBm. And the level we're talking about with these apparatus is closer to minus 90 dBm. So we're talking about 40 dBm. That's 10,000 times difference in signal strength.
So very, very weak signals. So
very, very weak. Much weaker than have ever been investigated seriously before. But they're the levels that we find in our homes. A study in Germany showed that 97% of homes in Germany have levels above the BioInitiative level, above minus 47, minus 50 dBm. 97% of homes have levels above that. And here we are, 10,000 times below that is the levels which affect biology.
Right. So that sort of sets the mind going as to, what does all this mean?
Yeah.
But before, I want to ask you, what the implications of your research are. But before we do that, I just want to touch on something else, the microbiome, because I know you've done some research on that. You've done a lot of work on the microbiome. So these microbes, that inhabit our organism, which far greater than the number of cells we have. It's an amazing amount of microbes which are thought to be beneficial in many, which is partly it's essential even. My question, okay, shaking his head. So my question is, how EMFs impact the microbiome. So just firstly, what the microbiome is, then your definition, and then how EMFs are impacting that.
Yeah, I could spend a whole day on this topic alone.
But I'm only going to give you 5 minutes.
Yeah. I had one slide in my slides last week on this topic. And it basically said, go to my colleague Amy Prowell's blog site and start reading because she's done a wonderful job of trying to tie all of this together with human disease. The leader of the conference that I was at in Lisbon last week made a statement a couple of months ago, which is all disease is the microbiome. And we firmly believe that from everything we've seen over the last 20 years. All chronic disease is the microbiome. You see, we have in us millions of species of microbes at all times. And the healthier we are, the more species we've got. The species actually tend to trim down a bit when one becomes dominant in disease. But you're dealing with millions of different species, only a tiny, tiny fraction of which can be detected by conventional lab techniques and lab tests. The rest have to be tested by DNA methods. And we've just written a new paper, which will be out soon, on microbiome. And if people keep an eye on Amy's website, which is called microbeminded.com,
okay,
microbeminded.com, then they'll be able to see pretty well what's going on with our publications. But we've just written one specifically which says that all autoimmune disease and the autoantibodies really come from reactions between the body and the microbiome, cumulative reactions over those millions of species, working together in many cases, because some of the microbes in our body fight each other. Strep and staph, for instance, fight each other quite aggressively. In fact, the best antibiotics that we've got against staph, the tetracycline family, were isolated from strep bacterium. So they're very, very actively antagonistic. Some species, other species are more cooperative. And, it's a total of what happens in the microbiome. Now, most people think about the microbiome as being in the gut. Mm-hmm. And medicine is happy to allow that to dominate the conversation because as far as medicine's concerned, it can easily sample and measure DNA from the gut by the feces and the urine. It's very easy to get. It's much harder to find out what microbes are in the brain. But there are microbes in the brain, lots and lots of them. Hundreds of various species have already been identified. And there's microbes in every tissue in our body. And every tissue has got a different microbiome from the one next to it. The microbes circulating in the blood are different between healthy individuals. They're different between healthy individuals and sick individuals.
So let me ask you, please, very quickly, how EMFs impact this microbiome.
Okay. Well,
very quickly.
There are a lot of studies coming out now in the last decade, particularly, because in 2008, the Human Microbiome Project was funded by NIH with only a very pittance of money. I think it was $50 million total that was put into it. But somehow they managed to bring out gold and diamonds. And everything that we know about the microbiome really started in 2008. It's less than 10 years old. And yet we now have close on 500,000 viruses that are sequenced and fully characterized, millions of bacteria for which we have complete genomes, fully characterized, so that we can study how those bacterium work, how the biology works. In many cases, it's similar to our own. E. coli, for example, has essentially the same glucose metabolism as humans do, going through the same intermediates and the same Krebs cycle. It's quite amazing when you get into it and study it at the level of the gene. So the problem is that we know that microbial colonies communicate with electric signals. Due to work being done by UCSD over the last 4 or 5 years, they've shown that electrical impulses, actual voltages at very low frequencies, do affect what's called quorum sensing. Quorum sensing is a way that microbial colonies signal to each other what size they should be. Are there plenty of nutrients, that sort of thing. And quorum sensing is fairly easy to measure, both in an in vitro experiment and even in vivo. And so we know they're affected by electric signals. Now, there are a number of studies, and the best one I saw was one where they actually put graphite, like Y-Shield paint. They put graphite around the outside of one of their capillary tubes to shield one colony from a close by separate colony. And the graphite completely attenuated the way that the colonies were interacting. No interaction, which would imply that there's also an electromagnetic effect, microbial colony to microbial colony. And at that point, you're pointing right at a real danger trigger for EHS, for electrohypersensitivity. Because if the microbiome changes in such a way that the inflammation in our body changes, then it could be even more sensitive than the human brain itself to the microwaves.
Mm. So the research is pointing to the fact that EMFs impact our microbiome, impact these colonies, as you say, this communication between. So if we can, because people are listening to this and they're looking for solutions.
Yeah.
So if we could try and address that now, please. So somebody who's listening, perhaps, who's struggling with what we call electrohypersensitivity. So what are your tips? What advice can you give in terms of EMF protection? How we deal with these EMFs?
Well, the most important time when the body needs protection is during sleep. During sleep, the body is regenerating, the immune system remains active, and we've found this empirically with the cohort as well as theoretically, that sleep is the time you really need to be protected. So if you're in a home that is not fully shielded, the place to really worry about it is the bedroom. And the best way to...
So you're saying the home should be fully shielded, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. The environment of the person, if they're electrosensitive...
Oh, sorry, just for who? The general population, or we're talking about somebody who's VHS?
What we found was that when you concentrate on people who are sick, which was our cohort, when we sent out these things, a majority, nearly all, but certainly a majority of people were convinced that it did something, either good or bad, but it was doing something. Then we did our experiment with the sleeping caps, which I've got over here. The sleeping caps, which are basically just silver shielded fabric.
Okay.
And we made 200 of those and sent them out to the cohort. and asked them to wear it 4 hours at night and 4 hours during the day, at night during sleeping. And did it make any difference? Did it do anything? And yes, it made a significant difference in 90% of the volunteers. That's a big number. It doesn't matter how you crunch the data. It doesn't matter how many provisos and doubts you want to express. A 90% response is a 90% response. So from what I see, anybody who's got a chronic inflammatory disease has a problem with EMFs, even if they don't realize that.
Okay.
That's what I was trying to convey at the Autoimmunity Congress last week, trying to alert the physicians that when somebody is taking a drug which is no longer working the way the physician would expect, or doing a therapy which is no longer working, the physician must start thinking in terms of EHS and electrosmog.
That's quite a bold statement.
Yeah.
Given that, I mean, I've got a statistic here. Autoimmune disease affects 1 in 5 people in the Western world, but in terms of chronic disease, it's more than 1 in 5. So we're looking...
It's up around the 60% that
about
are taking the
60%
drug.
of the population...
of the adult population, yeah.
Adult population has chronic disease, and you're saying that EMFs are a factor.
Yeah. It affects sleep, it affects behavior, it affects cognition, all of the things that an EHS person would be familiar with, very familiar with, are affected to different degrees in different people, depending on exactly what their disease state is and what their microbiome exposure is. Some microbiomes may not be particularly sensitive. We don't know yet.
This is quite a bombshell then.
Yeah, absolutely.
And a difficult pill to swallow, I imagine.
Not only a difficult pill to swallow, but it's also a difficult problem to cope with, to reverse.
Yes.
I mean, I'll give you the bad news first. The bad news is if you sleep in a Faraday cage, and you get an aluminium Faraday cage, similar to the ones that I had on my slides last week. I'll send you a slide of one so people can see it.
Sure.
It can be quite easily made out of PVC piping framework and aluminium from constructional foil around it. But if you sleep in a Faraday cage, then you'll get protection. Once you leave that Faraday cage, you lose that protection. And depending on how ill you are, really determines what's going on. And also the point you brought earlier is it's very important for the environment that people are in to be shielded in the case of a house in the suburbs, or many EHS sensitive people now tend to try and get away from population centres. Those people are still going to be affected by AM radio signals, because AM radio signals spread over thousands of miles, particularly at night. And you know, I wish I could tell you something else, but there's not a point on this planet that is not affected by man-made electromagnetic radiation. It's
so so it's a little bit doom and gloom, but there is hope.
You've got to start somewhere. Yeah.
I'm living proof. Let's not forget.
Yes, exactly.
And not just me. Lots of other people as well. For instance, Maureen Richards, who's in France. Lucy Sanford, who's a building biologist. There's a long list of people. Another doctor in the UK, which I also know. A long list of people that have recovered from this, what we call electrical hypersensitivity. But if we get back to this, and I understand what you're saying, but I'm just putting it in context, what you're saying. Yeah. But so back to these solutions and what we can do. So back to the Faraday cage. So your tips, your advice on this. So for somebody who is electrically hypersensitive, then you're saying that part of the solution is to sleep in a Faraday cage. Is that correct?
I'd say the first part of the solution is to say, do I have a chronic inflammatory disease that is undiagnosed? And really only the patient, if it's undiagnosed, only the patient is going to be able to go back.
So let me just put it like this. Okay, so let me put it this way to you. For instance, when I became electrically hypersensitive, there was no diagnosis. There was nothing.
Yeah, no diagnosis.
Nobody knew about this. I went everywhere, and it was just people thought I was crazy. I thought I was crazy. And there are people still in this situation who live in places where they're going to see doctors and people are not, but they know so they don't need somebody in a white coat to tell them. I put the cell phone next to me, I got the reaction. So just if you answer to that question, those people that know that they have a reaction, so it's very clear, there's no doubt about it. Yeah. What is your advice to them in terms
I would say
route?
Well, it's very important to not think of EHS as being in isolation. In France, of course, you know that MCS, multiple chemical sensitivity, is almost always seen with EHS. And also you have the Next Up organisation who don't have a good Faraday cage, but it's better than nothing that they've been getting out to patients, and it's been doing good. Half measures sort of work sometimes, but in clothing, no. If you want to just to
finish on the Faraday cage then. So the Faraday cage is something that needs to be tried. Is that what you're saying for somebody who's EHS?
It's the only way to get away from the radiation.
Okay.
That's really the bottom line. It's the only way to get away. And if it's a well-designed one, it'll get away from nearly all the radiation.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. Please go on.
If you've got a Faraday cage that you cannot receive AM radio inside, not FM, but AM radio inside, then it's a pretty good Faraday cage. And most of the metal Faraday cages will be like that. Unfortunately, the silver fabrics that we're using are not low enough resistance to be really effective at these lower magnetic frequencies, AM band and below.
So just to finish on the question of the Faraday cage before I asked you about personal shielding, it's not, because I know I'm reading between the lines, but what you're saying from the beginning is it's about nature and we can't outsmart nature. Yeah. Living in a Faraday cage there's nothing natural about it. So presumably we're talking about short to medium term measure.
Well, I don't want to overemphasize the nature side of things, because then when we're talking to people who need to listen to us, they tend to think, this is another natural healing type person.
Yes.
And we know that doesn't work, type thing. No, I look at it a different way. I think that it's absolutely impertinent of us at this point in time to think that we can do a better job than our bodies can do.
Okay.
That is we just know so much about the size of the microbiome, the complexities of the way the molecules interact now, and even about water itself.
Okay, agreed. But in terms of the Faraday, in terms of this question, so people, I get that, but in terms of this, so the Faraday cage is it short term, medium term, long term? Are you saying?
We've now got data over about a year, between 6 months and a year on the early adopters for the Faraday cages. And it makes a difference fairly quickly once they get beyond the initial immunopathology, which is the surge in symptoms. Once they get beyond that, then there is benefit in sleep, the depth of sleep particularly, and the other symptoms, cognition is another one that comes on quite quickly or gets better quite quickly.
How quickly, approximately? So you're talking about this immune pathology, which is kind of a healing reaction. That's another way of putting it. How long to get over that for the average person?
A year, 2 years.
Really?
Yeah. You're talking about I'm talking about a chronic disease.
Of course.
I'm talking about a microbiome that I was going to say started out healthy when you're a baby, but we now know that most babies are not born with a healthy microbiome, and that the mother's milk, microbes in the mother's milk, have a lot to do with it. But I don't want to get into that. That's another can of worms. Yeah. But, you know, throughout life, you've been accreting a microbiome, gathering a microbiome. And at some point, that microbiome will turn out to be a problem. And hopefully it won't be until you're 110, but at some point it probably
okay. So the Faraday cage, so we're talking about people, electrohypersensitive, that's extreme situations. The Faraday cage, from the research that you're doing, then there is a beneficial effect, and it can take 1 to 2 years to really start to feel the benefit. So if we can talk about, so now general population, you know, somebody who's health conscious, then obviously the Faraday cage is not a good idea. In most cases, I mean, it depends where you live, but what should be on that?
Well, this health conscious is the word that stopped me there, because, you know, if we're healthy, we're not conscious of it. We typically don't start.
Proactive.
We typically don't start being proactive until there's something wrong. These are the things we have to understand in order to understand what's happening to our body and what's happening to our mind and the way we think about what's happening to us. So I'm sorry. So we were talking about healthy, and you asked me a question. Somebody who's not EHS, the question is Faraday cage. I mean, personally, in my view, it's a definite no-no. Yeah, I mean, if the immune system's being affected.
No. The immune system's not affected. This is a healthy person. A healthy person does not want to live in
a healthy person has a very active immune system.
So Faraday cage.
Looking after all the cells that die off.
You don't need the Faraday cage. Okay.
Well, no, but I think it's wrong to say that they don't need protection from the electrosmog.
No, we're talking about the Faraday cage. The Faraday cage. We don't want the Faraday cage. If you're healthy,
why would
you want to shield yourself from all these other not native EMFs? That's my point.
Yeah, but some EMFs have got different mechanisms from others, and I'm not sure that they're all just as important to people who are quote-unquote healthy. Obviously, things like the microwaves, you don't want to be using cell phones near your bed, for example, anybody, because it's just asking for trouble. It's asking for a microbiome to develop that is far more aggressive than you've currently got. So I think it's wrong for us to assume that healthy people don't have to worry about this electrosmog problem. I think we all have to worry about it.
Well, but so if I can take you on your word now, so worry, no, but certainly be aware, and that's really the point of my EMF Summit here, Health Summit, is to raise awareness on this. So it is very important that we be talking about this and people be aware of these potential dangers.
Yeah, that's right, and that they humour anybody in their family that does need to use a Faraday cage in order to get the quality time during the daytime.
Okay. Can we talk so about shielding then? From what you've done, the research you've done, what are your recommendations on that?
If you want to shield the human body, it has to be a total shield. It has to be a total coverage. So you start with a hoodie, and a hood that focuses right down when you get into a difficult situation that you can tighten right up to just a little hole big enough to see through. A hoodie going through down into trousers, and people that are really sensitive may even need both gloves and also socks until they start to lose some of the sensitivity. That's not necessary forever, but it is It is basically necessary to shield every part of the human body, because somehow, whether it's along the nerves, through the blood, however it happens, somehow the energy that hits anywhere on the human body is reflected elsewhere in the human body. And what gave us that information was these things. Because people that have fibromyalgia pain in the base of their spine found that the best effect from these things is near their head, not down by their spine. The way the body conducts the energy, deals with the energy, we really don't have any great concept of yet. There are a number of people that think that it's conducted through the blood and the water and the fluid. Others that think it's necessary to go down the nerves.
So, in terms of the sleeping cap, for instance, which you just showed me, as a healing modality.
No, it's not a healing modality. It's an experimental modality.
It's an experimental modality, right?
The healing modality is the hoodie covering the neck region, particularly up to there, and just with the face exposed. The hoodie and trousers is the sort of minimal shielding modality that is actually shielding anything significantly well.
Okay, so obviously, well, we're running out of time, but this is really, this is just, I mean, for people who are listening, it's pretty huge. That's an understatement.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
It's we can't really, I'm looking for the words to put this, but it's highly, these EMFs are highly significant. This is what the research is, and these are my words, not yours now. I've just listened to you, but I'm not that I needed convincing, but because I get, from where you're sort of fairly careful kind of person, it seems, and you want the proof, and understand that. Somebody who's listening, who's living with EHS, doesn't need the science, they just want the solutions.
I don't want the proof. I don't want proof, because what we consider today as proof is rubbish. It's statistical rubbish. I want the understanding, because that's where science used to be in the 19th and 20th, early part of the 20th century. That's where we made the breakthroughs. That's where we found that the most of the antibiotics and even the steroids like prednisone, with all the harm they've done, nevertheless, they were a breakthrough. And that was done from an understanding. And what we've lost in the last 30 years is the concept that science needs understanding. It's very wrong. Science needs understanding. Any progress needs understanding primarily. Don't need proof. You need to understand so that your mind can play with the various possibilities, and you can gradually eliminate the possibilities one by one as time goes by.
Okay. Well, thank you, Professor Trevor, for being part of the EMF Health Summit. Your work is amazing. It's really groundbreaking, I feel. People do need to know about this. The implications are massive for, obviously, people that are suffering from chronic disease, but just for everybody, the implications are massive. And I'm sure that you're going to help a lot of people. So thank you. Thank you so much for
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And for all of you who have joined us today, thanks for being part of this movement. My name is Lloyd Borrell. Stay tuned for our next session. Thank you so much. Goodbye.